John Marie Straub was one of the most fascinating film artists of all time, in my opinion. His 1965 picture, his feature debut, Not Reconciled, is one of the more compelling works of film art produced during the 20th century, and of all time, I would go so far. Not Reconciled is an aesthetically minimalist adaptation of a novel, but one which attempts to emphasize, put a microscope on, the actual substance of the text itself. And extraordinarily powerful, I feel. The novel in question that it is based upon is titled Billiards at 9:30, authored by Heinrich Boll. According to Wikipedia, the entirety of the narrative takes place on a day in the fall of 1958, with flashbacks and characters' retellings from memory by the characters. It focuses on the Feiermel family's history from the end of the 19th century until that day. It largely reflects the opposition of the author to the period of Nazism, as well as his aversion to war in general. I'd like to read out one particular IMDb review from the 27th of January 2001. Marco S. Marino says it is a challenging film. This is one of the most important films made in the 60s and should be understood as an attempt to develop non-classical forms of film narrative in a politically oriented way. The movie is based on a novel by Heinrich Boll, which tells the story of a German family from 1900 to 1950, from the beginning of the 20th century to the rising of Nazism in the post-war years. The plot from the novel is, however, condensed and disarticulated in the film, with many flashbacks, and therefore the viewer is encouraged to reconstruct the story and to fill the gaps. This creates a fascinating atmosphere and conveys the main message from Straub, that Germany in the 60s was still haunted by the spectre of Nazism, and in that sense German people were not reconciled yet. If you're not used to art movies, this film will be a difficult one, but you should keep in mind that this movie is closer to a painting by Picasso than to a TV series. If you don't like this kind of movies, don't watch this one, and if you watch it by mistake, don't send silly comments to IMDb. Good point. I ought to mention, if you do happen to view this film, you may be a bit miffed and be under the impression that, wait a minute, the subtitles aren't complete on this film if you're watching it in English, and perhaps other languages as well. You see, from what I understand, it was intended for international distribution by Straub himself, that not every line in German be subtitled for an international audience, or something to that extent. Believe me, I was watching the film and I thought, and this would have happened to me before, I think. Unless I was watching a different copy of the film where everything was subtitled, I don't know. I know that for in official copies of this film, to this day, I believe they a few exceptions. I'm not sure. Someone clarify if they're aware. Only some of it is subtitled, and some of it is not. A majority of it is subtitled, to be fair. It's interesting though that Straub chose to do this. Perhaps they were so determined that this film was tied in with German culture, and some people say that knowing a language, knowing a distinct language, is knowing an entirely different world, or an entirely different cultural psyche. And perhaps John Marie Straub felt as though some of Not Reconciled could not be translated, and that the viewer who does not understand German ought to simply take in what's being said that they cannot understand, because they can. Maybe Straub feels that the power can still be conveyed. I'm not certain. I'd like to read out some biographical information sourced from Wikipedia about John Marie Straub, as well as his longtime collaborator and spouse, Danielle Hilliard. Actually, no, excuse me, that's Huli? I'm not fluent in French, frankly, obviously. We're a duo of French filmmakers who made 24 films between 1963 and 2006. Their films are noted for their rigorous, intellectual, stimulating style and radical communist politics. Though both are French, they worked mostly in Germany and Italy. From The Clouds to the Resistance 1979 and Sicilia 1999 are among the duo's best regarded works. Straub, who was born in Metz, met Paris-born Huli. As a student in 1954, Straub was involved in the Parisian cinephile community at the time. He was friends with Francois Truffaut and contributed to his publication Cahiers du Cinéma, though Truffaut refused to publish Straub's more inflammatory writings. He worked as an assistant to the film director Jacques Rivette on the 1956 film A Fool's Mate. He also worked in Paris as an assistant to Abel Gance, Jean Renoir, Robert Bresson, and Alexandre Astruc. That's one of the best people you can ever be an assistant director to. Oh my goodness. The pair later emigrated to Germany so that Straub could avoid military service in Algeria. Good on you. Straub spent his first few years researching Bach. Hulli had initially planned to make ethnographic films, but eventually assisted Straub on his projects. She wanted to be an Ulrike Oettinger. Fun. In 1963, they made Matroka Muff, an 18-minute short based on a Heinrich Boll story in their first collaboration. Their next film, the 55-minute Not Reconciled, was also a Boll adaptation. They did not make a full-length feature until 1968's Chronicle of Anna Magdalena Bach, after which they made films at a fairly even rate, completing a feature every 2 to 3 years. The production of the Chronicle of Anna Magdalena Bach was very tedious. The struggle for funding lasted for 10 years until 1967. In 1968, they also made a short film starring Rainer Werner Fassbinder and his theatre troupe called The Bridegroom, the Actress and the Pimp. I have not seen that. In the mid-1970s, they began producing films in Italy. Increasingly, they began splitting their time between Germany and Italy, as well as frequently collaborating with French and British producers. Straub and Hulli lived together for most of their lives. Cute. They had no children. Hulli died of cancer in Cholet on the 9th of October 2006, aged 70. How sad. Jean-Marie Straub himself was born in 1933. She was born in 1936. Man, Jean-Marie Straub's old. Because that's interesting, because he he would have been like 30 when Not Reconciled came out. That's interesting. He's 89. Man, he's nearly as old as Goddard was when he recently passed. It's all very upsetting. Every frame in 1965's Not Reconciled is a fascinating one. It is one that inspires envy at the DIY creativity which flourishes with this fine art sensibility in what is otherwise such a low budget, essentially garage film with these it's a fusion of the kind of DIY garage filmmaking and the more loftier gallery festival oriented highbrow intellectual European tradition of art sort of films. And I think the picture is a miracle. It's the kind of film that makes you want to study it, to learn all of its secrets. I may come back and do so one day. After all, at 55 minutes in length, well, it hardly seems like the most daunting task in the world, but that's the thing, it still might be.